Brothers and sisters, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and even before the Prophet ﷺ's prophethood, and from after his departure until the era and Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu, there were many methods that Muslims, along with the non-Muslims, would use to determine their dates and years, and there were different methods for each one to record history. There were many calendars that were in circulation at that time. A very monumental and important event that happened before the Prophet ﷺ became prophet was the event known as the story of the Fil, in which an unjust, oppressing ruler by the name of Abraham, in order to annihilate and destroy Makkah along with the Quraysh, sent a fleet of elephants. And many of us know the result and outcome of that army, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to us in Surah Al-Fil. This was such a monumental event, such a memorable event on how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected his house, that year was coined as Amul Fil, the year of the elephant. And it became a very important mark point for recording history of that time. When the Prophet ﷺ was crowned with prophethood, it was recorded by historians for it to happen these many years after Amul Fil, or this happened these many years before Amul Fil. So it became a benchmark. And at the same time, many different tribes and many different areas, they relied on a calendar based on whatever was relevant to them, or based on whatever they inherited from the governing or ruling body over them. Now, after the departure of the Prophet ﷺ, Islam started spreading far and wide, especially in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, who was Khalifa at that time. The stretch and span of Islam, it started encompassing people from all walks of life with different backgrounds, from different nationalities, who came from areas that were using different calendars. And this is no new thing for us, because even as we live in 2014, there are more than 36 calendars that are in active circulation. There's our Islamic calendar, there's the Chinese year, the Chinese calendar, the calendar that the Jews follow, the fiscal year. There are different types of calendars that are in circulation and are being used at this current moment. But obviously the most prominent and the most vast used one is the Gregorian calendar. Based on the calendar that we call this the year 2014. So, you can only imagine the confusions that started taking place in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, not only for historians, okay, but even for transactions and trades and loan repayments. That someone would take a loan from somebody who followed another calendar, and when the other person came to ask for his money, actually, that month is this month in our calendar. So he'll buy himself some more time. Or the person who's owed money would come earlier than that person was anticipating. So it's caused a lot of confusion and a lot of dispute. So during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu, he felt it very necessary to establish a calendar that was central. One single calendar that was central and could be established and implemented throughout the Islamic State, or the Islamic Empire, if you will. Not only a calendar that could be used from that day forward, but a calendar that could be the epicenter and center for all historical events that happened before the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, what we would designate as a starting point. So, Umar radiallahu anhu, he summoned many of the senior Sahaba who were around at that time, and his other advisors, and consulted them and took suggestions to what should we make as the beginning point for all historical events for Islam. Some were of the opinion to designate the year the Prophet ﷺ was crowned with prophethood. Some gave the suggestion that the year that the city of Mecca was conquered. Some gave the opinion that the year in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained fasting for the month of Ramadan. So many suggestions came about, and one suggestion that came about was to designate the year that the Prophet ﷺ performed his hijrah, his migration from Mecca to Medina, to be the center point to establish the Islamic chronology, if you will. Umar radiallahu anhu, when he heard this suggestion, he said that indeed this year was the year which a clear line was set between haqq and batil. It was a new page. Indeed, that year was a new page in the history of Islam. And after this meeting, a mutual consensus was made, and it was agreed upon by Umar radiallahu anhu that the year of the migration of the Prophet ﷺ should be designated to base all of Islam's historical events and current events. Now, prior to this, every year in Islam, historically speaking, was granted a particular name based on the most prominent event of that year. For example, as I shared with you, the year of the elephant. There was also Am al-Huzn, the year that the Prophet ﷺ lost his beloved. Am al-Hijrah, Am al-Fath, Am al-Aqaba. So every year was given a nickname for the sake of keeping record. But Umar radiallahu anhu and the other Sahaba and his advisors decided to make the year of Hijrah as the epicenter to start recording the Islamic chronology. Now, as you know, we are in the month of Muharram. And for those of you who did not know, FYI, it is the month of Muharram. And the month of Muharram, it kicks off the new Islamic year, which currently is 1436. SubhanAllah, just think that it has been 1,436 years since the Prophet ﷺ, with a heavy heart, tears filling his eyes, left the city of his birthplace, the city of his people, and migrated to the city of Yathrib, then turning to the city of Medina, and called that his new and final home. The Prophet ﷺ, while leaving from Mecca, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu explains that he looked at Mecca and said, "Ma atyabiki min balad wa ahabbaki ilayya wa lawla anna qawmi akhrajuni minki ma sakantu ghayrak." What a beautiful, what a pure city you are. If my people were not kicking me out of my own city, I would have never called any place but you my home. Now, one thing to keep in mind, that the actual migration of the Prophet ﷺ did not take place in the month of Muharram. It started in the end of the month of Safar and extended into the beginning of Rabiul Awwal. But the reason why Muharram was designated to be the first month, the beginning of the Islamic year, was that's how it was since the time of Jahiliyyah. And Umar radiallahu anhu and the other Sahaba, they did not see any problem in that. Therefore, they let it stand and let it be, that Muharram will be the first month of the Islamic New Year. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ, now going to the life of the Prophet ﷺ, when he was first given the mission and the message The first order to the Prophet ﷺ was to call his own family and his intimate relatives and friends, which resulted in the Islam of Khadija radiallahu anha, in Ali radiallahu anhu, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So there was a small handful of believers that were a result of the Prophet ﷺ's invitation. Now when that happened, they were met with some hesitation and resentment from Quraysh. But there was not that much resistance, because the Quraysh did not see them as a threat. In the beginning, the people that followed the Prophet ﷺ, apart from his noble family and close friends, were many of the people who were considered poor. So the Quraysh saw the group following the Prophet ﷺ to be these second-class, lower-class citizens. So it did not pose much of a threat to them. So there was indeed resistance, and there was hesitation, and there was mockery, but it did not reach a violent level. Then, and the Quraysh, what they considered it was an isolated, incident of self-denial. And they called the Prophet ﷺ, God forbid, that he was possessed, or he was a crazy person. But once the Prophet ﷺ started taking his message and moving forward with it, and more people were walking behind the Prophet ﷺ and following him, this started raising flags for the Quraysh. And they felt threatened as day went by. As every month went by, the Quraysh saw themselves being put in a position where their leadership was at threat. Because Quraysh, the mushrikeen of Makkah and the people of Quraysh, they considered themselves to be, they were very respected and honored people in their place. And they thrived on this. They liked to be the ones who called the shots. And they liked to be heard. And they liked to be obeyed. And one of the reasons that Makkah had such a strong economic structure was the fact that their bloodthirsty people and subjects were at bay because of their leadership. They did not just break into a fight unless they had permission to. So their leaders kept everything at bay. So their leadership, their stronghold, their position was very dear to them, as opposed to Medina, in which the leadership was not that strong, and the people were not that loyal. And this is why the city of Yathrib was not established as well as the city of Makkah, because all of the tribal wars going on between Aus and Khazraj, and all of this internal warfare, it tore the city apart. So the Quraysh saw people walking away from being loyal to them and started pledging allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ. So this increased their mockery and resistance and resentment towards the Prophet ﷺ and his companion. They did not lay a finger on the Prophet ﷺ till much later, because the Prophet ﷺ was associated with Banu Hashim, a tribe that the Quraysh respected a lot, and he was under the protection of his uncle. So they took all their revenge and vengeance on all of the Sahaba, all of the people who followed the Prophet ﷺ and tested their faith. And we know many stories in Sirah of how Sahaba, they were tortured and put to the test just to save their faith. Day by day, month by month went by. Finally, the day came when the Prophet ﷺ lost the protection of his uncle. And the Quraysh finally gained the strength and courage and started pushing the Prophet ﷺ around to the point where they called out a hit on the Prophet ﷺ. The physical torment, the mental and emotional pain that the Prophet ﷺ went through for years while he was in Makkah. Now throughout this time, in the times of Hajj, a group of people came from Medina, from Yathrib at that time, and they heard about this person and his message. And they accepted his message, and they pledged to him that we will take this message to our people in Yathrib, and we will make a pitch to them. Then in the next year, 75 people came from Yathrib, and they pledged allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ, and they promised him safety and protection in the city of Medina. One thing you have to understand, that when the Prophet ﷺ migrated from Mecca to Medina, it was not to flee from persecution. It was not to get away from the oppression, because the Sahaba were ready to die for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were willing to give up their lives to safeguard their faith, and many did so in the process. What hijrah meant, what migration meant for the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba at that time, was about moving forward. It was about changing the atmosphere around them and transforming the surroundings around them, not so they can just practice their religion freely. Because we know, after the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, did everything become hunky-dory? Was everything smooth sailing after that? No. There were a whole different set of challenges that were in Medina for the Prophet ﷺ and his people. The reason the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina was to build a community, to establish a union that would help the flower of Islam blossom and flourish, and to share the faith. When the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, one of the first orders of business was to establish a masjid. Now when we hear masjid, we think of a masjid. We picture the masjid in Medina, but in reality, a masjid is not a name of four walls and a structure. And if you study about the original masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, it was very frail, feeble, a very weak structure, a very humble structure. The purpose of building a masjid and establishing the city of Medina was to establish a community. It was about community. It was about establishing a unity of brothers and sisters, each one playing their own part. Islam is not just for the menfolk. It's not just for the brothers. There were no walls or partitions or curtains in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. There was no discrimination in accessibility to the Prophet ﷺ's mosque towards women. There was mutual respect, mutual modesty, and bashfulness, and taqwa. And women played a huge role in propagating Islam that often gets overlooked and underestimated. Brothers, there is no double standard in Islam. And I know this topic is for another time and another place, but there's no double standard in Islam. You don't look down only when the sister is covered or when the sister walking towards you is a Muslim, and not look down when the sister is not a Muslim. The fact of the matter is, people look up and down and keep on looking up and down. There's no double standard in Islam. Now going back to Medina, remember the city of Medina was torn apart by fire, right? And when they heard this message while visiting Medina, they saw hope in it for themselves. They saw in that message a new beginning, an opportunity to start fresh, to turn a new page. They saw in the message of the Prophet ﷺ something that a platform that could bring everyone in Medina on one level. Now with that being said, When the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, he did not abolish all lineages and affiliations and associations. People still belonged to their tribes. There was a concept of Muhajirin and Ansar. There were always groups and associations and affiliations there, but the Prophet ﷺ did not let these associations cause them to divide the Ummah. He did not allow that. We are all one Ummah. And we have to understand that we are all Ummah. One Ummah. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ went to Medina to establish. He did not go to Medina to seek power. He did not go to Medina to be a leader. He did not move to Medina looking for wealth and position and fame. He was already offered all of that. The Prophet ﷺ in the beginning days of Islam was offered power. He was offered wealth. He was offered women. Very famous story in Sirah that the Quraysh called the Prophet ﷺ and gave this huge lecture, and then they told the Prophet ﷺ, فَإِن كُنْتَ إِنَّمَا جِئْتَ بِهَذَا الْحَدِيثِ تَطْلُبُ بِهِ مَالًا جَمَعْنَا لَكَ مِنْ أَمْوَالِنَا حَتَّى تَكُونَ أَكْثَرُنَا مَالًا. If it's money that you want, take it all. You will be on top of the ladder. You will be on top of the food chain. If you want to rule over us, here is the crown. If you want to seek women, we will wed you with the most beautiful woman amongst us. And if there is something wrong in your head, if you are possessed, we will call the best help out there to take this demon out of your mind. But stop your message. So he was offered all of these things. If it was money and position and leadership that he was seeking, he would have done it. He was offered this by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When an angel came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, would you like to be a prophet who is a server, O Malikan Rasulah? Or would you like to be a prophet who is a king? And the Prophet ﷺ, he chose to be a humble prophet who served his people. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he went to Medina, it was not to seek all of these things. He went to establish something that money could not buy, that fundraisers could not establish, and that was a community. And brothers and sisters, each and every single one of us that is sitting here has their contribution to play. We are all gears, different types of gears, all working together to move in one direction, and that is what is going to make the community move forward. All of us that are sitting here, the sisters upstairs, the brothers downstairs, we are all here for one another, to offer one another a boost, not to pull each other down. We are here to offer one another a boost. And when you get up there, you offer your hand and pull that other person up. That's the only way we're going to move up, not by stepping on one another. The Muhajirin, they opened the Ansar, they opened their hearts to the Muhajirin. They opened their houses for them, their families for them. They stayed hungry to feed them. They stayed cold to keep them warm. They gave them shares in their businesses, in their investments. They limited their own resources to give them comfort. Likewise, brothers and sisters, if we want Islam to flourish in this country, if we want to move forward in this country, in this city, we need to work together. We need to sacrifice. And I'm not saying go and just start writing checks to one another, but there's other things besides money that come in the way, like pride, arrogance, and ego. Let's put a cap on our emotions and stop giving away the most valuable asset that we have. The most valuable asset that a Muslim has, the thing that will help him on the Day of Judgment, is a person's deeds. Stop giving away those deeds by backbiting, by slandering one another. It's so ironic that we can give away our deeds to one another, but we can't show appreciation or share a compliment for one another. So don't give away your deeds. Don't be the biggest loser for the wrong reasons. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده أما بعد. Just to wrap up, since it is the month of Muharram, I wanted to end today's khutbah by sharing with you some virtues about the month of Muharram. Now, the month of Muharram is indeed a very sacred month, and it is coined by the Prophet ﷺ to be Shahrullah al-Muharram, the month of Allah, to show its dearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ stated that there is no month that is better to fast after the month of Ramadan than the month of Allah al-Muharram. And in this month of Muharram, there is a particular day that is known as Ashura, the 10th of Muharram. Now, there are many different riwayat and ahadith in different books which explain the origin of the fasting of the 10th day. There are some ahadith that indicate that the 10th of Muharram was observed as a day of fasting even from the time of Jahiliyyah. And when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, he noticed the Yahud celebrating on a particular day. And the Yahud of Khaybar will go out into the field and have this big celebration and festival in which their ladies would wear all their gold. And he inquired about this, and the Prophet ﷺ was told that this is the day that they celebrate because it was the day Musa ﷺ and his people were granted liberation from Fir'aun and his clutches. The Prophet ﷺ said that we have more right to be happy for this and celebrate this. And the way a Muslim celebrates is by worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ ordered his Sahaba to fast on that day. And before the ordinance and the mandate of the fasting of the month of Ramadan, the 10th of Muharram, the Ashura, was one of the mandated fasting. And then later on was abrogated by the mandate of the fast of month of Ramadan. The Prophet ﷺ has stated in the hadith that the fasting of the day of Arafah, it takes care of 2 years of sins. And the fasting on the day of Ashura, it takes care, which means it expiates the previous year of sins. So it's very important that to observe fast, and it's very rewarding to observe fasting on this 10th day of Muharram. And there are also some ahadith that indicate that the Prophet ﷺ was informed that the Yahud would fast on this day as well. The Prophet ﷺ replied to that by saying, لَإِنْ بَقَيْتُ إِلَىٰ قَابِلٍ, if I am alive on the next year, then I will add the fast of the 9th day to that. And that's why we get this concept of Tasu'a and Ashura, although it is not necessary. But one thing to understand from here is that the Prophet ﷺ, by mentioning this statement, that he will add another day, the Prophet ﷺ made it a point to encourage and educate his ummah and Muslims that, look, we are Muslims and we do things differently. The reason he wanted to add another day was to differentiate between the amal of the Yahud and the amal of the Muslimin. So the Prophet ﷺ is making this point that, you know what, we do things differently. And brothers and sisters, no matter where we live, especially in the United States, we need to understand one thing. That although we are a part of this society, and we are here to stay, and we make up, and inshallah will continue to make up a good portion and a contributing portion of the society that lives here, being a good Muslim means that we have to be courteous and show good citizenship, but at the end of the day, we are different. and our standard of values and our system of morals are different. And when I use the word different, I mean unique. So at the end of the day, we are different and we are unique. And that is what this country has been founded upon. So don't try to think that just because I am living in this country, it is an obligation for me to do as the Romans do. We are Muslims. We do things differently. We are unique. And this is a great thing of this country, that you can be as unique as you want. And there's crazier things and weirder things out there than the Muslims. So we don't have to participate. And we don't have to be a part in every single holiday, hint, hint, or every single thing that society around us does, because we are different. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Tuba lil ghuraba," glad tidings to those who are the strangers.